Our story begins with a chubby boy sitting on his bed, astonished by what he sees on his phone. He has been reborn in this world, but it seems that the social roles of men and women are reversed. At this moment, it has already been 2 days since he arrived in this world, but he still hasn't gotten used to this fat body. In his past life, he was a famous alpha male emperor. However, now he is in a world where men are being mugged in the streets by girls. Women have the role of giving birth, but it is the men who take care of the child and the house. Besides all this being strange, the spiritual energy of this world is low, and it won't be easy to regain his power, so he might be forced to wash dishes and be submissive to women. In his past life, he fought a very powerful demon, and both lost their bodies. It seems that only his soul survived and ended up reviving. Now he is in the body of Lin Mo, a rich and spoiled boy from a private school. Thoughtful, he wonders if that demon also revived, so he must live as Lin Mo until he regains his strength. That's why even an emperor needs to go to school. Looking around, he assumes that his family isn't too bad. Still, that house is smaller than his last fish tank. In his memories, it seemed that his parents died in an accident, and his grandmother was in the hospital with advanced Alzheimer's. His distant aunt took on the role of guardian after being abandoned, and along with her, his family also moved. Before he knew it, everything that belonged to him was already his aunt's, and his quality of life had decreased. Walking through the house, the boy approaches a table. The one with the hair that looked like a cow had licked it was named Jun, and the other was Shixuan. The boy's aunt appears, saying he arrived just in time to discuss his studies and that Yin Hui was right, mentioning that school was a joke. Hearing the name his aunt mentioned, the boy becomes thoughtful. In his body's memories, his grandmother organized a wedding for him before she had Alzheimer's, and the girl's name was the same. However, she was shocked when she learned about it, disdainfully asking how he could go out as someone fat like him. While crossing the street, he was accidentally hit by a truck. When that happened, his aunt cancelled the wedding, thinking that it was incredible because the emperor of his generation would have to marry someone from that world by another woman's decision. Still in the kitchen, his aunt asks if he is listening to her. The boy says it was nothing, telling her not to arrange another marriage for him. Observing Lin's expression, the woman thinks he seems different. Unexpectedly, there seemed to be a feeling of inexplicable tyranny. Then Lin sits at the table, thinking that he hasn't had an appetite since he started his diet. But for that body not to starve, he should take it easy. Picking up a piece of food, he thinks it smells good. Then his cousin asks why he wasn't going to study abroad since his classmates knew how much he expressed his love for others. Lin wonders why he needed to talk to those insects when this emperor reigned for thousands of years. Still, now it was necessary to play the role of a normal person, saying he wouldn't go now because he was happy with that school. The boy says it didn't matter which school he attended as long as he got good grades. Continuing to eat, Lin thinks he didn't want to talk to him. An hour later, the protagonist was inside a car, and the person driving informed them that they had arrived. His cousin, in turn, asks Lin not to get out with him. With a look of disdain, the protagonist observes him, leaving the boy scared by that look. Then he got out of the car, frustrated. Next, Lin was already in front of a building. Mentioning that the architecture of that world was excellent, however, there were some problems. Each of those men stood out a lot since they showed their pale legs and even made gestures like girls, but at least the women seemed normal. In the background, 2 girls were teasing the protagonist's brother, saying that his legs were beautiful. With disdain, the boy thinks that it was unpleasant enough to almost make him vomit. However, he should forget about it because he didn't know if that demon was still alive. Plus, he needed to strengthen his body before she appeared. As he walked through the school, Lin finds his classroom. In the background, someone seemed to mock the protagonist, saying that his fiancé /U00E9 was there. His wife was sitting at the table while 2 girls were talking to her. Observing the protagonist, she didn't seem to like his presence. Lin thinks it's incredible how unbearable mortals can be. The boy, heading towards his desk, leaves Yenui confused. While sitting down, he thinks about how he could resume his cultivation in some way. Someone taps him on the shoulder, saying he should believe her when she said he couldn't like her. This was a girl with red hair giving him advice. Remembering the girl, Lin thinks she must be the classmate of that body. Continuing to speak, the girl questions how he could like someone from the 2nd class. Noticing Lin still quiet, she assumes she has spoken too much. Saying that there was still a chance with Yenui, who might like him if he lost a bit of weight. Then the protagonist asks her to just say what she wanted to say. The girl asks how he knew she was plotting something, and Lin mentions that she wasn't that kind. Next, the girl really wanted to ask him a favor. Requesting to play a game with her, saying it wouldn't take long. And as a reward, she would introduce him to a girl more beautiful than Yenui. There is a mountain that cannot be reached alone, but she had contacts to help climb directly, so she was thinking of going during the summer. Mentioning that the place was impressive at night, and he would regret refusing to go there. Lin thinks of a rumor that high mountains attract spiritual energy, and that mountain was the closest in the region, so there was a high chance it had energy at the top. Also, it was a great opportunity for that body to lose weight by climbing the mountain. Accepting the proposal, he mentions that he wasn't good at games, making her happy. The girl says they would have a match against an idiot from class 3 who loves to pretend to be good. So after class, they could use the computers in the computer club. Sometime later, in the computer room, the girl mentions that she had reserved the room just for them, so no one would bother them. Sitting in the chair, she asks Lin to connect to a user. Then the protagonist enters his password, successfully logging into his account. Inside the game, the boy, looking at a window, says it was a competitive action game with an immortal theme. That girl appears, saying she had called the boss of that realm, because he would help them. Then the boss appears, mentioning that she had indeed brought a man, apparently liking the protagonist because he was a classmate of her friend. Cutting the mood, she says she would start the 3 versus 3 PvP mode. Starting to run, the girl asks them to be quiet while she would take down the enemy group. Then the protagonist's friend asks him to hide while she goes to check. Lin thinks that only legendary beings from his world can be immortal, but cultivation in everything from his world was similar to the game. Assuming there was a probability that there were immortals in that world, so he should be careful. While sitting, a notification appears that someone had died. That girl from before appears, apparently stressed. Starting to run again, she says she made a mistake and now would take revenge. However, she ends up dying again. Repeating the cycle of running again, but now the protagonist's friend would help. Even so, it was of no use. Outside the game, the protagonist's friend is furious because even the boss of that realm couldn't defeat that person. Telling the protagonist to be careful because Flying Feather was on the way, but Lin was completely calm. While running, the boy thinks he had developed his fighting instincts over thousands of years, capable of using them even in games. Throughout all this, the other team was still behind the protagonist while 2 girls fawned over the person playing. Then the girl says he couldn't escape from her. Looking back, Lin realizes someone is following him. Stopping to run, he thinks it was an emperor, and that's why he had never been chased. Noticing that Lin had seen her, the woman quickly hides. The protagonist, in turn, asserts that it was a quick reaction and that body couldn't win since attacks in that game were hard to use. Outside the game, Lin seemed to be using a skill. The woman observing the protagonist mentions that he was a novice who had no idea where he was, so that was a positive point going against the boy. Quickly, Lin uses the keyboard and mouse, launching an attack on the woman. Suddenly it hits her where a notification of a dead player appears. On the other side, they were surprised that the protagonist had managed to win. Getting up from the chair, Lin's friend says she didn't know he was so good. Noticing him motionless, she questions if everything is okay. Lin thinks he had no idea a body like that could be so damaged by a simple use of spiritual energy. Returning to the game, one of his friends asks to go back, but she no longer had time, thinking she had finally found him. Wondering why he always kept running away, but this time she would kill him, going after the protagonist. Meanwhile, the boy ran without stopping. Noticing that the girl had found him again, he thinks he should boost the lower part of his body again, throwing his sword towards the woman. Then she questions if the boy wanted to hit her from so far away. At that moment, her leg gets hit, where she ends up falling to the ground. Looking at the sword in her leg, she wonders if that was a warning to stop following him. Outside the game, one of her friends says they should stop chasing him. The girl, in turn, asks if she knew the other side, asking to contact them right now. Sitting in the chair, she murmurs the protagonist's name. On the other side, the protagonist's friend receives a call from those girls wanting to see her. Approaching Lin, his friend says he was amazing, suggesting to play a few more matches, but the boy didn't want to play anymore, asking her not to forget the promise he had made before. Sometime later, Lin was already near his house. Inside his room, the boy lies down, mentioning that his body was very fragile. The next day, while going to school, his cousin calls him, asking him to explain to his classmates that the marriage with Yanhui was not real. Then the protagonist says there was no need to explain what was false. As he was leaving, his cousin says he was very arrogant. Inside the classroom, his friend notices his presence, asking if he knew who that girl from before named Zhao Yutong was, mentioning that, incredibly, she was from his school. It seemed he had been through a lot since he lost his love, mentioning that the girl wanted to see him and he didn't need to worry because she wouldn't do anything to a guy. But before he could finish the sentence, with a threatening look, the protagonist watches him. Suddenly he doesn't complete the sentence, mentioning that it wasn't Momo baby. Then a girl approaches the protagonist's table. That was Yanhui saying they needed to clarify things and he should say it was just a fake marriage. Lin's friend says she was going too far. After all, Lin Mo was just a boy and should have more compassion. The girl questions what that had to do with anything and if she liked the protagonist. Jumping into the conversation, the boy says that whether it was true or false, there was no possibility of him being with the girl, asking her to leave. Yanhui says he was being too full of himself and didn't know how much that bothered her, so he should never say he would marry again. The boy in the background says Lin was very strong because he hadn't cried yet, and the other guy says that if it were him, he would leave school immediately. Then someone enters the room. That was the girl he had lost to before, accompanied by 2 more people. The people in the background mentioned that was Zhao Yutong. Rumors said she caused a lot of trouble, and everyone who got involved with her dropped out of school. Approaching Lin, the girl calls the protagonist. Apparently, Yanhui was her sister, asking if she wanted something. Then the girl calls Momo Baby, which was the protagonist's profile name in the game, telling him to follow her. Meanwhile, Lin, irritated, continued sitting in the chair, thinking he was the emperor and not Momo Baby. In the background, those two boys ask how he got close to Yutong and why he was being called Momo Baby. His friend, in turn, apologizes because the girl wanted to play with the protagonist alone. She just needed to go out with her and then could do whatever she wanted. Leaving the room, Lin murmurs that those people were very annoying. At the door of his class, Yutong was waiting for him, thinking he didn't expect Momo Baby to be a man instead of a woman, claiming that it was fun because back in the day, women fought in combat skirts, but now that had become a norm for them. Then she starts asking Lin several questions, questioning if it was him who defeated her in that game, giving an order to look for him after class because she would duel with him alone. But Lin says she didn't play that game and had only won by luck, saying she would go back to class. Irritated, Yutong wonders if the boy didn't know who she was. Then the other girl states that it was no surprise Lin wasn't afraid of her since there was no more love in her heart because she had been left. Yutong, in turn, gives the order for her to bring the boy at noon. Returning to the classroom, a group of boys asks what Yutong had said to him. Her friend says that the girl had been attracted to the protagonist, so she just wanted to play with him alone, asking not to worry because she would take him to Wuju Mountain on the weekend and would arrange for some girls. With a threatening look, Lin tells her not to bring anyone else. Imagining supposedly illicit things, the girl feels embarrassed, saying various things and that she shouldn't be interested in her. Then the other girl appears saying that Yutong was waiting for the protagonist. However, Lin was no longer in the classroom. In the cafeteria, Lin was eating while people in the background teased him, saying he ate too much. At the reception, the boy asks the man to wrap it up for the trip. Leaving the place, the protagonist thinks he still hadn't gotten used to that noisy world and he shouldn't get upset about that. In the background, someone approached the boy, murmuring various things about that body dying in a year and if he wished to survive, he should merge with her, and as a reward, she would fulfill his wishes. As he walked, people around observed his beauty. The woman says she had made the right decision. From now on, her 18 years of life would be part of her, mentioning that it was a pity that all the joys and sorrows they had gone through were just a drop in an ocean for her. After working hard for so long, she managed to defeat the emperor. However, it wasn't the ending she desired and now the only thing she could do was revive the demon world. But the emperor had many tricks up his sleeve so he wouldn't die easily. Therefore, she should be careful since he could have gone to that world, claiming that that world was very interesting. She had never gained her father's approval in the demon world, no matter how hard she tried, just because she was a woman. Those men belittled her and only wanted to possess her until the day she put on a mask of evil spirits, killing them so they would fear her. However, in that place, men were at a disadvantage, and cultivation wasn't bad despite the spiritual power being scarce. Moreover, she was beautiful enough for men to follow, but it had been a while since that fat guy had been after her, and as a woman, it was good to be direct. Looking back, their gazes met. The girl, in turn, asked him to stop following her because there would be nothing between them. However, our boy walked straight past, ignoring the poor girl. Embarrassed, the girl thinks she should regain her strength before leaving that world, mentioning that the boys in that world were very shy, so Lin should have been embarrassed, refusing to admit he was chasing her. That's why she hadn't said anything to avoid embarrassment. Returning to the protagonist, he was apparently bothered, wondering why that girl was following him. Noticing that Lin was going to the terrace, he thinks he should look for another place to be alone, but he remembers that normal students never went to that place. The people in that world are spiritually and physically weak, questioning if Lin would jump off the terrace. However, that was none of his business. Even so, he still felt bothered, remembering that the friend of the owner of his original body had also jumped from a building. Heading towards the terrace, he thinks he would fulfill that body's will. Reaching the top of the building, he sees the protagonist at the edge of the terrace. Then he uses a skill to immobilize him. However, he had forgotten that he had no spiritual power. Meanwhile, Lin calmly thinks that it was quite cold up there, so it would be better to go down for lunch. Then that girl appears, asking the protagonist to wait. While grabbing his stomach, Lin asks what she was doing. Lifting the boy, she asks the protagonist to come down. But she is surprised by the boy's weight, falling to the ground with him, where she even ends up breaking a rib. On top of her, Lin says he didn't even have time to respond, questioning what she was doing. The girl says she was just helping him because he was going to jump in an isolated place, thinking she had broken a rib because of him. Surprised, Lin thinks the girl thought he was going to jump off the building, assuming it was because in that world, men were fragile while women were strong, extending his hand to help, asking to control her imagination since he had only gone out for some air and did not intend to jump off the building. Moreover, he was not interested in her, leaving the girl embarrassed, telling him to never show up in front of her again. As Lin leaves, he thinks that the woman had dismissed the help of an emperor without even knowing it, and since she didn't want help, there was nothing he could do. Back in the room, his friend asks where the young man was, mentioning that Yutong was looking for him and telling him not to leave after class. The protagonist, in turn, says that all of this was her fault, so she should solve it on her own. But the girl says she would go with him after class to play with Yutong, and if she let him win, it should be enough to leave him in peace. Even so, Lin says he wouldn't go, thinking he didn't want to lose to a little girl, even if it was just a game. His friend continues trying to convince the protagonist, but the young man says the problem was hers. The girl says she would do anything for him, but Lin had already decided he wouldn't go. Then his friend thinks she had messed up. Sometime later, the day passes. Getting up, the protagonist says it's time to leave and shouldn't forget his promise on Wuju Mountain. As he leaves, Lin remembers something, recalling that he had fallen on that girl, wondering if she was okay. The human body is very fragile, so she probably ended up breaking a few ribs. Since human lives in that world were precious, he could end up getting arrested, which would cause a huge problem. Looking for the girl, Lin thinks he should check. Meanwhile, she was still on the terrace, claiming that her body was very weak and she couldn't get up. Moreover, it was very windy, and she was hungry. Thinking even about screaming for help but wouldn't do that even if she died, she didn't expect that could happen. An invincible demon who defeated the emperor was brought down by a fat guy, then someone approaches the girl. Realizing it was Lin, the girl questions why he came back. Kneeling, the protagonist observes her, thinking that she didn't seem to be well. Then he places his hand on her back, saying that she had broken a few ribs, mentioning that she was very weak and needed to exercise, but the girl says that happened only because of him. While Lin takes off his suit, the empress, embarrassed, asks what the protagonist is going to do. Covering her, the young man mentions that it was windy on the terrace, asking her to wear his suit. Making a call, he says he's going to call an ambulance, but the empress says she didn't need his jacket. The protagonist already knew she didn't want to wear his jacket because she was fat, but she should remember that her body was fragile and could take it off when the ambulance arrived. However, for the girl, it wasn't for that reason, as she didn't expect the protagonist to be so kind. This world has a beauty standard for men, thinking she didn't know why Lin helped her, but would keep an eye on him anyway. Sometime later, the ambulance arrives. While the empress was on the stretcher, two girls noticed that commotion. Embarrassed, the girl thinks she would never forget that day. At night, the protagonist was already near his house. Entering, his cousin asks why Yutong had gone to talk to him. Then Lin says he would only say that once. Zixuan, in turn, thinks that fat guy had a sharp look, mentioning that he had been more aggressive lately, saying that Yutong must not have gone after him of his own will and must have gotten into some trouble. Because of that, he would ask his mother to kick him out of the house. Then Lin, questioning what he was talking about, mentions that this was his house. Zixuan, about to slap the boy, says he had asked for it. With no effort, Lin holds his hand. While squeezing his arm, he thinks he was very weak. So weak that it wasn't worth continuing with that. Fallen on the ground, the boy says that it hurt, going to tell his father that Lin had hit him. Appearing in the kitchen, his father asks how he dared to hit his cousin, saying he would take care of him. However, with no effort, the protagonist also holds the man's hand. Surprised that Lin Mo had held him so easily, Lin, in turn, says he would give him a piece of advice to never mess with him. Crying, the guy says he was an abuser. Calling the protagonist's aunt, saying he was causing trouble. Arriving in the living room, she tells them to be quiet. Staring at Lin, she thinks the boy was different, saying she didn't want to know what happened and it was just to apologize to her uncle. Lin, in turn, thinks she was the first person to ask an emperor to apologize. Saying that he wasn't wrong and therefore wouldn't apologize. However, she says that if he didn't apologize, he wouldn't receive his vacation allowance. But the boy says he didn't need that. Entering the room, Lin wonders if she was talking about money. Remembering that if he didn't have it, there would be no way to go to Wuzu Mountain. There was nothing to sell in that house, plus he had no savings. Thinking about selling some clothes and shoes, Lin opens his computer. Surprised because a buyer arrived so quickly. 3 girls in the comments of the post were asking personal questions and if he still had the smell. Surprised, the protagonist thinks he has never been afraid. Not even of demons, but those women scared him. Even so, he would sell to make money. Wondering why money was the first problem since he should first recover his strength. The body is the foundation of cultivation and if he could absorb spiritual energy, money wouldn't matter. A few minutes later, the boy was completely exhausted and without spiritual power. The body couldn't take it, so he should forge his body from scratch. Then he receives a call from his friend, saying she wanted to talk about Wuzu Mountain. Mentioning that her friend said he would go there and if it wouldn't be better to go another day. Lin says it's no problem and they could go anyway, then the girl says the bus would leave in the morning so they shouldn't be late. The next day, the protagonist goes to the table to have breakfast. Zixuan asks why he woke up early and if Yenhui didn't ask to go out with him. However, the boy remains silent. His cousin, in his thoughts, questions why he wasn't responding and if he was planning something. saying he could continue eating like a beggar because his bus had arrived. Near the bus, Yenhui calls the boy, saying she was scared and that they should get in quickly. Inside the bus, she says Lin was different since she had rejected him, mentioning that last night she had pushed him while arguing with her father. Yenhui, in turn, says she always knew it wasn't a good idea to take Lin to Wuzu Mountain, claiming he would go too, and the other girl says he looks like a whale's pacifier so he wouldn't be able to climb. Then the protagonist's friend appears, saying they were in the same class and shouldn't talk about him like that. The girl thinks she didn't expect Lin to come, but he wasn't afraid of Yenhui, so she would stay with him so he wouldn't feel alone. Then Lin appears on the bus. As he goes to his seat, Yenhui stops the protagonist, asking why he pushed Zixuan. Interfering in the conversation, the protagonist's friend says it must be a misunderstanding because Lin was a calm person, calling the boy to go to the front of the bus because there was a beautiful view. At the front of the bus, she asks the driver to stop at the next place to pick up the other person. The protagonist, in turn, hopes that when they arrive at Wuzu Mountain, he won't be disappointed. Looking to the side, he notices a girl riding a motorcycle, stopping the motorcycle in front of the bus. Suddenly, the bus is forced to brake. Removing her helmet, it was Yutong. The protagonist's friend gets nervous, fearing she stopped the bus to go after Lin Mo getting out of her seat. She says she would talk to her, questioning what she was doing there, and Yutong says she was looking for that fat guy. Noticing Lin, the girl mentions that if it weren't for his size, she would never have noticed him. Then everyone starts laughing at the protagonist's face. Yutong tells him not to go to Wuzu Mountain and that it would be better to go with her to play video games, and if he did that, he could make his girlfriend come back. But the boy didn't want to hear that, asking her to leave him alone. Then Yutong asks if she was bothering him, thinking that if it weren't for him, she would never have lost even once in her life, questioning whether he would go with her or not. Then Lin seems to be surprised, noticing that the girl's necklace had a bit of aura. Thinking that his refining technique was a bit poor, but that was something difficult to develop in this world, wondering if there were still cultivators. Saying he would play with her when he finished climbing the mountain. Then the protagonist's friend suggests that everyone should go to the mountain. Yutong asks if Lin was really willing to climb that place. It seems he wasn't popular, besides being fat, so she would watch him try to climb that mountain. Meanwhile, another guy appears saying he had space in his seat, suggesting she sit next to him. But the girl didn't want to know, calling one of her friends to watch her motorcycle, questioning if Lin had that game because it was to play with her now. However, the protagonist says that if he won, he wanted something in return. Accepting the offer, Yutong says that if he lost, he should be his servant forever, ignoring another guy while talking to Lin. Then the other man asks Zixuan if Lin was good at games and why Yutong insisted on playing with him. Zixuan, in turn, thinks he had no idea what was happening, and the protagonist was a nuisance. Returning to Lin, the boy was playing with Yutong that game from before. Noticing an opening, he prepares an attack. Yutong is surprised because he was trying to attack him at high speed. Receiving the attack head-on, the system informs that the victory belonged to Momo Baby. Out of the game, Yutong still couldn't believe he lost, questioning how he managed to have such incredible precision, but the protagonist says that every movement he made was calculated, and that game is very easy. Then the girl thinks he was a genius, but little did she know he was using his cultivation to stimulate his brain. Since Lin had one, she should ask for what she wanted. Lin, in turn, asks for 10,000 in money. Yutong asks if that was all because whenever he wanted, he could force his ex-fiancée /U00E9E to come back with him, and if he was willing, he should become his training partner from today. Ignoring the girl, Lin still asks for the transfer, thinking she had managed to get the money to forge that body. Taking out his phone, Yutong makes the transfer. In addition, he added his phone number so she should answer if she called him, but she shouldn't call him or even give his number to anyone. The protagonist thinks that not even as an emperor did he have an arrogance equal to hers. Getting up from the chair, the girl says there was very little space, giving an order for Yenhui to move forward, leaving the girl nervous, thinking he was doing that after so much effort to sit next to Zixuan. Getting up, Yutong tells her to hurry up. Yenhui thinks about reprimanding her sister but couldn't do that in front of everyone. Then Zixuan says that Lin wanted to say something to her and that she should see what it was. Getting up, the girl goes towards the protagonist. In his thoughts, the boy is happy because he could sit next to Yutong. Trying to introduce himself to the girl, Zixuan only gets a sharp cut with Yutong telling him to shut up, thinking that if he had known that boy was so unbearable and wore so much perfume, he would have preferred to sit with the protagonist. Arriving at Wuzhou Mountain, the students are surprised by how high the place is. Then the protagonist's friend tells everyone to follow and not fall behind. Half an hour later, Lin Mo, observing those boys, thinks they were much worse than him. When he managed to recover his powers, he would punish them every day for centuries. The protagonist's friend, noticing that there was no one to help him, thinks she couldn't help him because if someone saw her with him, she might end up receiving strange looks. 20 minutes later, Lin Mo was still climbing the mountain. Thinking he couldn't go on because he had the least stamina in the group, those boys seemed quite delicate but were actually in good shape. Noticing that Lin couldn't take it anymore, his friend thinks that since she was the one who brought him to that place, she should help him, questioning if the boy needed help. But Lin Mo says she could continue on her way because he could still keep going, thinking that this fatigue was nothing compared to the things he went through in his previous life. The protagonist's friend wonders why she was putting in so much effort for this, saying she would go ahead and if she couldn't climb anymore, she could let him know. The people in the background are surprised because the protagonist had already managed to climb halfway. The other boys, already exhausted, couldn't continue on the path. While thinking of giving up, Lin Mo, determined, continues to climb. The protagonist, near the top, notices a group of people coming back. The other girl is surprised because he managed to get there alone and was very resilient. The protagonist's friend, saying it was very high, thinks they should go back and go to a restaurant. However, Lin says they could go because he would reach the top. Irritated, his friend questions if he wanted to die, but the other girl tells her to just let him go. 20 minutes later, the boy finally reaches the top of the mountain. Yutong, who was already at the top, is surprised that he actually managed to climb. But it was a pity he fell behind most of the time, and when he managed to climb, the others had already come back, besides being alone the whole time. Looking up, the boy observes the stars. Thinking that, up there was a lot of chi, although it was little to recover his power, at least he could start training. With that, he would already be ahead of that venerable demon. As long as there was an opportunity to train, no matter the time, he would always go back up there. Then Yutong puts a hand on his shoulder, asking what he was doing, and the protagonist says he was just looking at the scenery. The girl thinks he is very annoying, besides speaking little. And the protagonist in his thoughts affirms that in his world as an emperor, he would have killed her several times. Then Yutong tells him to get down because that place was hers now. Lin mentions that he was very tired, so he should help him down. Yutong says she wouldn't bother him anymore that day, handing a snack to the protagonist. From now on, she would be his companion, and since she was bored, she would go down first. Opening the paper, he realizes that it was leftovers from the girl's snack, mentioning that in his previous life he had eaten several beast corpses, so that was nothing special. Sitting down to meditate, the boy thinks he should start by cleaning the marrow. Sometime later, it starts to get dark. The protagonist's friend, on a call with him, asks if the boy really wasn't coming back. Lin Mo says that place was pleasant, and that's why he would stay during the holidays. Messing with his phone, he thinks he should inform his aunt. Calling her without any ceremony, he immediately says he would be away for a few days during the holidays. Hanging up, the attendant asks what he could do for the protagonist. Then the young man asks how much a single room would cost for 2 months, and the man says it was 8,000 yen. Thus, Lin Mo continued his training during the holidays. Day after day, climbing the mountain without stopping, the training was rigorous, but the fruits would be worth it. Then 2 months pass, and the protagonist's friend informs him that she was arriving, and if his bags were ready. Thinking that she hadn't been able to talk to him during the holidays, and because of that, Yutong was always bothering her. That's why she had to take him to Yutong, no matter the circumstances. Meanwhile, Lin Mo looked at himself in the mirror, thinking that after 2 months, the spiritual energy in his body was still weak. Appearing all jigachad, he says he should still continue being a mediocre student. Sometime later, the protagonist's friend says she finally managed to find him, but when she looks at the boy, she is surprised by his beauty. Assuming she had confused him with another boy, imagining having a family with that man. With a look of remorse, the protagonist notices the girl staring at him. Embarrassed, she starts to walk away, thinking that the protagonist must think she was a pervert. Then Lin asks where she was going, because she hadn't made a mistake. The girl in turn questions if he was a friend of Lin Mo. However, she says he was Lin Mo. However, she doesn't believe his words, assuming they just had the same name. But the protagonist says he had only lost some weight, asking why she was so surprised. However, the boy had changed drastically. Everything about him was completely different. Picking up the bags, Lin says they should go. Then the girl thinks that by his cold look and way of speaking, he was definitely Lin Mo, thinking that she wasn't dreaming and that the boy had changed a lot. Affirming that it was worth it not to have treated him badly in the past. Asking to carry her backpack. However, another girl appears offering help to the protagonist. Quickly, her friend approaches the car, opening the door for the young man. Inside the car, she mentions that he was now very handsome, asking if he had been climbing the mountain all this time. His efforts were definitely worth it, and when Yen Hui saw him now, she would regret breaking up with him. That's why now many girls would be nice to him. But he had to understand that all of that was falsehood, so Lin asks her to just shut up. Fearing, her friend wonders if the protagonist hated her for not climbing the mountain with him. If she had been kinder before, he might have fallen in love with her, and they would have had a perfect love. However, there was still an opportunity because she was still the closest to Lin. Saying that he must have gone through a lot, and that's why they should go out to eat something, but the boy just wanted her to take him home. Sometime later, the young man was already at home, and his friend says she would see him in a few days. Then the other girl asks if she wasn't going to take the protagonist to see Yu Tang. However, Yin Shu says she wouldn't take him anymore, thinking she couldn't take a beautiful lamb to the wolf's den. The only thing she needed to do was use Lin's account to play. Then Lin Mo enters his house. The whole family is surprised by his appearance, asking who he was and how he had entered. However, the boy says he was Lin Mo and had just lost weight. Even so, Zixuan doesn't believe it was him because even if he lost weight, he wouldn't be that handsome. Then his mother asks him to stop shouting, asking if the boy had undergone any surgery. The boy mentions that she had all her money, so there was no way to do that, questioning if he would receive his money that semester. His aunt says she would pay all his expenses and also buy a new uniform, but if he did anything bad to his cousin or uncle again, she wouldn't give him another cent. Standing up, Lin says he was already satisfied, and his aunt thinks he really was the protagonist. The next day, the young man was in a car with his cousin going to school. Zixuan asks why the driver was driving slower this time. Then the girl says she would go faster, thinking that she couldn't help but look at the protagonist because he was very handsome. That's why she just wanted to keep watching the boy. Then Lin gets out of the car. Everyone around is surprised by his beauty, wondering who that boy was. His cousin, feeling jealous, questions why Lin was attracting so much attention. Noticing that the girls were taking pictures of him, the young man thinks something wasn't right. Soon after, he enters his classroom. Heading towards his chair, another girl wonders if he was a transfer student. Lin, for his part, thinks he had just lost weight, but just because of that, he was already a bit better than usual. However, normally he wouldn't attract so much attention, questioning if it was because of his aura. At the classroom door, a commotion was happening. Yu Tang, holding the protagonist's friend, says she would give 3 minutes to bring that fat guy to her, but Yun Shu says there was no fat guy anymore. The girl mentions that she would regret continuing to lie, then Yun Shu says she would tell where Lin was. Pointing her finger at the protagonist, she says he was Lin who had lost weight during the holidays. Observing the boy, Yu Tang seemed not to believe it. Furious, she says that guy could never be Lin, but Yun Shu was telling the truth. The protagonist, for his part, says the girl wasn't lying, saying he could train with her whenever she wanted and to meet after class. Then Yu Tang asks who he was. Again, Yun Shu says he was Lin and that he had lost weight during the holidays while climbing Mount Huizhou. In her thoughts, Yu Tang wonders if he really was the boy, questioning if he was really that fat guy while the boy asks her not to call him that anymore. Noticing he had the same voice and behavior, she affirms he really was Lin, saying it didn't matter if he was fat or thin because he should wait for her after class. Yun Shu says it had been another person who had played with her before and Lin had only joined to complete the group, which is why the protagonist wasn't very good at games. With a threatening look, Yu Tang watches her, asking if she dared to say Lin didn't know how to play, mentioning that yesterday she had used Lin's account to try to deceive her, and for that, she was the most arrogant person who tried to do that. As she was leaving, Yun Shu asks to explain herself, thinking that now Yu Tang would never leave her alone. Two girls appear asking how she knew it was Lin. Even if it was the boy, there was no way he could have become so handsome, so he must have had some plastic surgery. Then the teacher appears asking everyone to sit in their places because she was going to start the class, saying she was curious to know how their holidays were. However, she ends up being surprised, questioning who that student at the back was. Yun Shu raising her hand says it was Lin who had lost weight during the holidays. Surprised, the teacher says he had changed a lot and must have worked hard to achieve it, asking if the boy didn't want to sit in the front this semester. Quickly, a girl responds no, mentioning that Yun Shu had promised they would switch places with her. The other girl says she had grown a lot during the holidays and should also go to the back. Yun Shu thinks they were trying to take her seat, but she wouldn't let that happen. The teacher, asking them to stop arguing, says the first person to change seats would be Yun Shu. As two girls pulled her from her seat, the protagonist's friend begs to let her stay in her seat. Another guy asks Zixuan if Lin had had plastic surgery to become so handsome, and the boy replies, there was no other way but that. The teacher says the odd numbers would stay in the same position and the even numbers would switch with the adjacent ones, saying that Li Zhang would sit with Lin. The other girl asks if Zhang would really sit with the protagonist. Then the girl says it was fine because she couldn't let Yun Shu take him for herself. Looking at his classmate beside him, the young man realizes he was a bit chubby and also calm and quiet. Because of this, there would be no one to disturb him. Yun Shu sitting up front, crying for having left her seat. Then Lin Mo stands up from his seat. A group of girls starts to flatter the young man, saying they would be exhausted if they had to climb the mountain every day, and another asks if he could give some advice to her brother. Yun Shu thinks they were all fake because when Lin was chubby, no one talked to the boy, saying that unlike her, she had never treated the protagonist badly when they first met. Lin coldly asks them to get out of his way. Quickly the girls make space. The other girl says the protagonist looked very handsome when he had that attitude. Noticing Zixuan stressed, the girl mentions he was jealous, but it wouldn't matter because they preferred Lin. Returning to the protagonist, the young man was inside the cafeteria. A girl waves at him saying he could sit in her place because she had to leave, but Lin declines the offer, thinking he wasn't sure if it was safe near those mortals. Mentioning that the eyes of those women were nothing less than deceitful. In the background, Yan Hui questions if he was really the protagonist. Zixuan asks if she regretted breaking up with him now that he was handsome, and the girl replies that she wasn't that superficial. Another girl appears saying she wanted to go after Lin Mo, asking if she could help him, mentioning that it didn't matter if he had surgery or not because she always liked him for his personality. Then Yenhui calls her a hypocrite. Hearing what she said, she thinks hypocrisy was believing that was plastic, and if she could get Lin's beautiful legs, she wouldn't care if they were fake or not, saying she would go after the boy alone. Meanwhile Lin Mo was walking through the school. Then Yenhui appears, saying she was there to apologize for everything, mentioning it had been sudden for her and she still didn't want to get married. Accepting the apology, the protagonist walks away. Asking Lin to wait, the young man questions if there was anything else to say, affirming that he truly felt sorry for everything he had said. Lin, continuing to walk, makes Yenhui wonder why he had that cold reaction, supposing she must have been the reason for his change. Outside the school, Lin Mo hopes there is no one on the rooftop. While walking, he encounters the girl who had broken her ribs, wondering if she wanted to steal his spot on the terrace again. Looking back, the girl realizes Lin had been following her for some time, mentioning that he resembled the protagonist, but that man was more handsome. Then Lin passes by the girl, who feels relieved because she thought the young man would talk to her, questioning if he was also going to the rooftop. Reaching the boy, she notices he was climbing the stairs. Quickly she passes in front of him, noticing the girl was in a hurry. He wonders if she really wanted to steal his spot, questioning how a mere mortal could want to do that. Their gazes meet and each perceives the other's intention. Quickly, they start running to protect their spots. The girl thinks the protagonist was very annoying, asking if he shouldn't behave like a gentleman. Also, how could he run so fast, mentioning she just wanted to give him a chance, but if she lost, it would be a disgrace for the women of that world. Meanwhile, a girl was watching that commotion. Returning to the two, the girl asks why Lin was running, and the young man says he wanted to know the same from her. Then she questions why he wasn't running after her, but the young man says he would never do that. Irritated, the woman tells him not to speak to her that way. A boy like him who didn't care about ladies could never get married. Lin Mo wonders how an emperor could think about marriage, a man of high status from a generation of great emperors. Responding that she wasn't kind either because she was fighting just over the terrace. Reaching the rooftop door, the two block the entrance. Suddenly they start fighting to see who would arrive first. Lin, in turn, thinks he would have to use brute force to clear his way, or he ends up squeezing the girl's breasts, which makes her feel embarrassed. The protagonist, feeling awkward, senses that sensation. He quickly manages to reach the terrace first, saying that from now on that place belonged to him. The girl questions how he dared to do that and if he knew who she was, mentioning that just a moment ago he had done that. Saying he had touched her, the protagonist approaches her, giving a slap to the poor girl, claiming that she had touched him first. Thinking that he had almost forgotten that men in that world were fragile, and therefore could not act calmly. Then the girl calls the protagonist, shameless. Taking her phone, Lin says that if he didn't leave, she would call the police. The girl, in turn, says she was already getting angry. Recording the woman, the young man asks to repeat what she had said before. However, he seems to remember something, recalling that women who hit men in that world were despised. And if she were caught doing that, she could no longer attend that school. Thinking that he had taken advantage of that to hit her, even if she told someone, certainly the one who would be believed was the protagonist. Saying that this time he would leave, but next time he wouldn't lose. Claiming that it was very complicated to deal with men. Lin thinks he was happy to have gotten out of that situation, mentioning that the girl was very annoying. Remembering that there was an update on the news from this morning, he grabs his phone. Looking at the news, he ends up getting surprised. The news reported numerous chickens on a farm suspected of being infected with a virus, which ended up turning into dry corpses. Observing that chicken, Lin Mo seems to recognize it. Recalling that the demon from before had a sword that would suck any creature that touched it down to the bones. But in his final battle, that sword had exploded, and then his sword also exploded trying to protect him. And along with that, he ended up going to that world. Wondering if that demon was really dead. Since to become immortal, Lin had to follow the path of heaven. But she, in return, only had to kill people to gain her power. That's why he had to investigate what was happening. Sometime later, it was already sunset. As Lin was leaving, the girls were still fawning over the protagonist. Yunshan appears saying she would accompany him to Yutong's house. But Lin Mo says it wasn't necessary. Even so, the girl insists on going. Mentioning that Yutong and her sister were very dangerous. Telling the story of a time when a boy was tricked by his classmates, which ended in a tragic end. However, the boy thinks he doesn't want to go to that place, asking Yunshan not to get too close to him. But the girl says he was interpreting things wrong. Entering, she is surprised, asking if he wasn't going to meet Yutong again, and the boy says he had more important things to do. Yunshan questions if he didn't know she had been looking for him all vacation, and the young man says they would discuss that later. The girl, in turn, asks him not to worry because she would explain to Yutong the next day. Remembering that if she helped him, Lin might end up thanking her. Meanwhile, the young man was inside a car thinking that farm was outside the city, and if that demon was there, he would eliminate her, even if it damaged his soul. Sometime later, Lin Mo arrives at the location, thinking he still had little soul, but it would be necessary to use it. Apparently, he begins to use a spell. Looking at a house, he notices a demonic chi, thinking that it was extremely strong, assuming that demon had really survived. Looking to the side, he notices someone approaching. A person says they had seen the protagonist from afar. Taking off the helmet, it was Yutong asking what he was doing in the middle of nowhere. Lin, in turn, wonders how she had gotten there, thinking that it couldn't be a coincidence to meet in the middle of nowhere. Saying that she had called a taxi to take her home, but on the way, she realized it was taking her out of the city, so she decided to get out of the car. Irritated, the girl asks if he still thinks he was that ugly fat guy from before. Now that he was handsome, he would end up meeting many girls who only think with their lower brains. Mentioning that handsome young men are the biggest targets when it comes to trafficking, and he shouldn't forget to warn someone when he gets into trouble. Asking him to hold the helmet, she says she would call the police. Asking if he remembered the car's license plate, but the boy replies that he didn't. Then the girl says she would deliver some messages and would be right back. Lin, in turn, thinks that Yutong was just a mortal, but could also attract demonic energy. Then he notices that she had returned. Mentioning that losing weight was causing her problems, she asks him to hand over her helmet. Putting it on her head, she says she didn't want to get into trouble. However, she feels embarrassed. Thinking that the boy was more handsome than those motorcyclists on the internet, Lin wonders if that was a protective helmet. And the girl thinks he really was handsome, questioning how he had that ridiculous idea. Mentioning that it was his personalized helmet, and if he broke it, he would give it as a prize to the mean girls, saying that it only gave him headaches. Looking at where the girl was going, he realized it was exactly where the demonic energy was. As he was worried, he would check what was happening. Returning to Yutong, the girl seems to pass through a place she shouldn't, where an old lady ends up noticing, questioning who the girl was looking for. Quickly, Yutong draws a weapon, saying that she had a lot of courage not to run when she saw her. Desperate, the old lady says she shouldn't be playing that kind of game because it was against the law. Then Yutong questions if she knew the law of the demon cultivator. But the old lady says she was just a chicken farmer. Stealthily, she draws a dagger from her sleeve. Yutong, realizing the woman's intent, fires her weapon. With her arm bleeding, the old lady begs not to be killed. The girl mentions that she was a good actress, but would have to be better to deceive her. Using a spell that transforms her weapon into a sword. Even so, that old lady insisted she wasn't a demonic cultivator and had nothing to do with that incident. Yutong says that now she was only capable of refining chickens, but in the future, it could be people's turn. Mentioning that she had little cultivation time but was better than a monk. Then the old lady asks how she hadn't noticed that, saying she would go further if she refined her. Yutong says that was encouraging, quickly advancing towards the demon, asserting that the outcome wouldn't change, stabbing her sword into the chest of that monster. Lin Mo, in the background observing the situation, thinks that energy seemed to be that of a demonic sword. Yutong in turn seems surprised, because her sword had no effect. The girl thinks that energy was completely different from the demonic cultivator she had encountered before, questioning what that creature was. In a matter of moments, the monster lunges at Yutong, where she barely dodges, assuming that if she received that attack, she would definitely die. Again, that creature envelopes a spell in its fist. Then Yutong takes a piece of paper. It was a spiritual talisman thrown towards the monster. However, it has no effect, where the demon again attacks the girl. Suddenly, she is thrown against the wall. While spitting blood, she thinks she couldn't believe she had lost. At that moment, the protagonist appears to defend the girl, who asked what he was talking about since she should leave that place. Lin asks to speak politely, but Yutong gives an order to leave. Quickly, the young man seems to use a skill, where the demon stops moving. Yutong, surprised, asks why he had stopped. But Lin says it was nothing special, because he was the one there. While fleeing, the demon ends up falling to the ground. Before the monster, a giant aura surrounded the protagonist. The girl mentions that pressure was very strong and she couldn't breathe, wondering who Lin really was. Meanwhile, in another place in time, Guayuan, in the city of Luobei, a man says that Tao was what gave rise to heaven and earth, encompassing all things. Then the man seems surprised, questioning why the bell was ringing, and if that shouldn't happen only when there was a great event in the world. With the master kneeling, his subjects ask if he is okay. Then the man says that the father of Tao had just reincarnated. Returning to the protagonist, the boy asks where that demon was. However, that creature had already lost all its spirit, mentioning that it was just a fragment of the sword. Even so, that didn't matter. Using a skill, the young man seems to absorb that spirit, thinking it could be a trap from that demon to reveal its location. But it was a good item to cultivate when its demonic nature was eliminated. The only thing he had to do now was take care of that woman. Behind the protagonist, Yutong says he was very handsome. Using magic, the boy gives an order for her to forget what she had seen. Then Yutong ends up fainting. Observing the girl, Lin thinks that her spiritual root was of the highest quality and that was incredible even in his world. However, that meant there was a good place to cultivate in that world. Otherwise, it would be impossible to reach that level. Right after using his ability, the boy feels a pain in his chest. Assuming he had overloaded his residual soul. Thinking he should leave that place. Where he ends up finding two girls mentioning that he was very handsome. And that they would take him to a pleasant place. But Lin asks to be released or he would regret it. Then the girl says she was just pretending to be tough. Asking him to be a little kinder. Irritated, the protagonist thinks that since his soul was damaged, he couldn't use his strength. Touching his face, the woman says he should obey her. Meanwhile, Yutong was behind the two. Asking them to get out of his way. He throws a punch at the woman. Who barely dodges. The other woman tries to attack Yutong. But the girl dodges and counterattacks. Quickly, she delivers a kick to the other one. Where she ends up knocking both out. Approaching Lin, she asks why he hadn't defended himself. Saying that when encountering people like those, he should strike with all his strength at their weak point. The boy questions what the vital point was, and Yutong replies that it was the chest, and asks if he didn't even know how to defend himself. As she leaves, the girl says she would take the young man to her house. When she was about to take off her helmet, Yutong asks why she had taken it off, asking her just to get on the motorcycle. Getting on the motorcycle, the two head towards Lin's house. The protagonist thinks that in his past life, grabbing a girl without being in a relationship would be considered indecency. But in this world, they didn't think much about it. However, that vehicle was very fast. Mentioning that with his sword, he could go faster than that. In the still of the night, the two arrive at their destination. Lin, thanking for the ride, asks how much she would have to pay. And the girl questions what she was talking about, calling him fat. She mentions that just a little while ago, the boy was scared. And the protagonist asks her not to call him that. Then Yutong says that before, Lin didn't care when people called him that way. In the midst of the conversation, the girl remembers something, saying that the protagonist had tricked her again and left her waiting. But the boy says that his family taught him that he should return home after class, because he couldn't walk alone, saying he had waited for her before. However, Yutong mentions that he had an emergency. Then his phone starts ringing. Answering the phone, Yutong asks if everything was done. Affirming that the target had a very powerful evil chi getting on his motorcycle, he says he had something to do. As he heads towards his destination, the girl stops at a corner, thinking that the smell of the protagonist's shampoo was bothering her. Returning to Lin, the boy thinks he needed to recover. Then Zishuan calls him, questioning if he was causing trouble with Yutong again. Yenhui, in turn, says that the boy didn't know how to choose his words, and was trying to say that Yutong was a bit stressed. Lin, ignoring the two, continues heading towards his house. Inside his room, the boy sits by his door, supposing that if he continued using his power, he could end up damaging his foundation. At least he managed to get a sword fragment that he could use to cultivate. Soon after, someone knocks on the door. Yenhui appears, saying she wanted to talk to the protagonist. Noticing that she wasn't with Zishuan, he thinks the girl wanted to be alone. Then Yenhui says it wasn't just about looks. But the more time she spends with her cousin, the more she realizes she liked the protagonist. That's why she wanted to apologize for everything she had done. Asking if his grandmother wouldn't want them to get married. Before she could continue speaking, Lin closes the door. Begging, the girl asks him to believe her, saying they would get married. However, since Lin was an emperor, he didn't want to lower himself to that level. Thinking that he thought he had already reached the maximum level of spiritual cultivation, yet he still had a long way to go. Starting to meditate, the boy considers it as mental resilience training. The next day at Lin's school, a girl calls the protagonist to eat. Noticing that the boy had ignored her, she mentions that he was very handsome, but had a heart of ice. And he was getting more handsome, looking even like a movie star. Meanwhile, Yenhui, along with her group, was eating. Looking to the side, she notices a girl trying to call the protagonist to her table, who without any remorse, ends up refusing. Zishuan asks what good it does to be handsome but alone. And the other guy says he had questioned how he lost weight, but he always ignored him. Observing that situation, Yenhui seems restless. Getting up from the table, she says she would call the boy to her table since they were in the same class. Irritated, Zishuan asks why she would call him since the girl already knew he hated him. Reluctantly, Yenhui asks the boy to let her go, or else Lin might see her and interpret it differently. Irritated, Zishuan says he had no more respect for him, and that if he went to get the protagonist, he didn't need to come back. However, the girl thinks that if she could have Lin Mo in her arms, she wouldn't regret anything in her life. Meanwhile, a group of girls was bothering the boy, who wonders why all those women were bothering him. Next, Yutong calls the protagonist, ordering him to go to her desk immediately. The boys observing the commotion assume that Yutong was supposedly interested in Lin. Yenhui, in turn, desperately thinks that that girl was the worst one to attract Lin's attention. The young man, for his part, cannot believe that woman was still calling him fat. Looking to the side, he spots that girl from before. Quickly, he starts walking, remembering that there was a possibility she would steal his spot on the terrace. While the young man walked, Yutong noticed him in a hurry. The girl next to her says that Lin had become very arrogant after getting a bit more handsome, asking who he thought he was. Furious, Yutong sends a message to the young man saying she would kill him after class. Returning to Lin, the boy was approaching the terrace. However, that woman was already in her resting spot, saying that since she had arrived first, Lin should leave. Refusing to leave, the young man mentions that he had won the race before, so that spot belonged to him. The girl says she had let him win because he was a man, asking if he thought she would lose. Then the young man suggests they go downstairs to bet on another race to settle this once and for all. Irritated, the Empress says the boy only knew how to run, and asks if he had any other skills besides that, for if he continued like this, he would never get married. Lin Mo for his part, says there was nothing special, stating he could choose any game because he would win against her in any of them. With a sly smile, the girl seems to be planning something. Picking up a cup of pieces, she says they would play that game. Watching what was in the girl's hand, Lin wonders if it could be what he was thinking. Then the Empress questions if he knew how to play that game and if he won against her, besides leaving the terrace, he could ask for anything. Sitting on the floor, the young man mentions he wouldn't be able to fulfill any of his wishes, even if he tried. Convinced, the girl thinks she had spent thousands of years playing that game, and her skills were on another level. Little did she know that the protagonist had also spent many years playing that game, known as one of the best in his world. As they were about to start the game, the two stared at each other. In the middle of the match, both sides were completely focused. Realizing he still hadn't won, Lin wonders if that woman was some reincarnation of a player from that game. Sometime later, the match continued until sunset. The girl, observing the situation, realizes that the match was uncertain, and if she wasn't careful, she could lose. The young man says that if she didn't know what to do, she should give up. However, the Empress mentions that classes had already ended, so she should feel proud of getting this far and therefore should go home. Soon after, Lin's phone starts ringing. Thinking he could never give up and would only leave that place with victory. The girl, for her part, could no longer stand the noise of that phone. Taking a picture of the board, she mentions they could continue the match the next day. However, when she was about to get up, she feels a shock in her leg from sitting for so long, where she accidentally ends up falling on top of the protagonist. Lin, for his part, feels a very cozy sensation. A moment later, the girl becomes completely embarrassed, saying she couldn't believe that. Then Lin slaps his forehead, saying that next time she should keep her magic spheres away from him, or he would call her a pervert. The girl thinks that this was already the second time he had hit her, and when her strength returned, she would make him regret it. But during the night, she would study tactics to win their match. Outside of school, Lin Mo picks up his phone to answer the call, realizing it was Yutong who was calling him. Furious, the girl questions why he hadn't answered her and where he was, ordering the young man to go to the school gate. The young man thinks that Yutong spent most of her time at school playing, and even so, she had a high cultivation level, so he would discover today what her secret was. Near the gate, Yutong asks why he took so long, questioning why he had stayed at school after skipping all the classes. However, he says he was just sleeping, leaving the girl surprised, saying she had come to pick him up for a rematch in that game. Handing a helmet to the young man, she tells him to get on the motorcycle. Sometime later, the two arrive at Yutong's house, and the protagonist is surprised that the place is so big. As they walk through the house, Yutong asks him not to touch anything. Looking around, Lin Mo thinks that the only thing in that place was games, and there was nothing about cultivation. The girl, in turn, questions whether the boy was not worried about being in that place, for a woman had called him to go to her house and the boy asked nothing. Then the protagonist questions if he intended to do anything with him. Mocking the boy, he mentions it was a good idea since he was no longer fat, and it wouldn't be a bad idea after all. Without any compassion, the boy strikes her belly, ordering her not to touch him. Seeing the damage he had done, the young man thinks he didn't know that martial art was so good as it could take out a cultivator in seconds. Getting up, Yutong says he was just joking, but the protagonist says he didn't like that. Irritated, the woman warns that they would play more than 300 matches, thinking she would finish off the boy and make him pay for everything he had done. Sometime later, inside the game, Lin Mo wins a round against the girl. Soon after, 2 more times, that cycle continued countless times with not a single victory for the girl. Downcast, Yutong realizes she was losing 47-0. Getting up, the boy mentions he needed to go. Sneakily, he seems to place something under her table. Asking for another match, Yutong says he could stay at her house, but the young man says they would continue another day, saying he would take him to his house. Lin Mo says he would get a taxi. The thing the protagonist had placed under the table starts to fall. Seemingly coming to life, it begins to move. Meanwhile, in some random building, Yen Hui, in her room, was pondering why Lin had skipped afternoon classes, wondering where the boy had gone. She then receives a call. Someone asks her to check the message group, because something unbelievable had happened. Looking at the messages on her phone, she sees a photo of the protagonist with Yutong. Irritated, the girl starts to knock everything off her desk, questioning how dare she take her Lin Mo to her house, wishing for a motorcycle accident to happen to the woman. However, cursing wouldn't help at all. Then a purple crystal asks if by any chance she wanted to take revenge. Looking around the room, she questions who was there, asking them to show themselves. However, the crystal says its identity was of no relevance. Then a sinister face appears, saying it could do whatever she wanted. Yen Hui, in turn, asks if that monster was a witch from those soap operas. Embarrassed, that creature thinks the woman had nothing in place of her brain, saying it was the #1 divine sword of the immortal world that ended up shattering, and if she helped it recover, it would turn her into an immortal. Without even thinking, Yen Hui accepts the proposal, asking for help to become an immortal. At that moment, that creature seems to use magic on the girl. A purple crystal appears on Yen Hui's forehead, and the monster orders her to open her mind, allowing it to merge with her body. Asking why she felt no power, the spirit questions what she desired. Suddenly, the girl asks to be taught hypnosis, and the monster mentions there were numerous skills like that. In her thoughts, Yen Hui supposes that with that skill, Lin Mo would be entirely hers. Meanwhile, the protagonist was riding in a taxi, thinking he couldn't use his powers carelessly, believing Yutong should reveal her secrets. Quickly, the boy seems to make a hand signal. At Yutong's house, that doll receives a signal. Observing, the girl realizes she was playing, questioning if Yutong was a false cultivator, wondering how she had managed to reach that level. Furious, Yutong cannot believe she lost to a stinky fat guy. Lin Mo, in turn, gets irritated by the girl's words, mentioning he would now crush her in all the games. Then Yutong remembers she had to do something. Watching her leave the room, Lin Mo wonders where the girl was going. In the room, Yutong was changing clothes. Wearing a suit, she says it would work. Opening a closet, there were numerous combat weapons in that place. The protagonist thinks that even if all that was of low quality, it was still hard to obtain in this world. Starting to run, the doll jumps into the girl's clothes, thinking that this time he would discover her secrets. Sometime later, Yutong arrives at a building, thinking she should find out what shampoo the protagonist used because it smelled so good. Inside that building, the girl approaches a door. Meanwhile, someone says they should raise their glasses to celebrate the newlyweds. In that place, a wedding was happening, and the woman mentions the bride would make a speech. Taking the microphone, the woman thanks all the people who came even without time. Meanwhile, Yutong sits in her place, thinking that now she just had to wait for it all to end. After a while, the other woman declares that the wedding ceremony between Lin Yu and Su Chu has ended, and now they could start the party. Returning to the two newlyweds, his wife asks if he is very tired, but the man asks her not to worry because he just needed to change clothes and drink something. While they were talking, someone approaches the two lovebirds. It was Yutong standing in front of them. Realizing who it was, the young man becomes desperate. The bride in turn asks if something is wrong. Then Yutong says that now that his wish has been fulfilled, it is time to go. As he begins to transform, the man asks if she thought fulfilling wishes was so easy. In that instant, the young man transforms into a werewolf. When he was about to attack the girl, Yutong uses a talisman. Dodging the attack with a leap, he draws his sword. Attacking the wolf from above, with one blow, it is knocked to the ground. Holding its neck, it thanks the girl. And in a matter of seconds, its head disconnects from its body. Desperate, his bride tries to help the man. In her thoughts, she apologizes to the woman because she would never see her again, mentioning that that form was a stupid way to die. Returning to human form, his wife runs into his arms, pleading for him not to die, ordering them to call an ambulance to help him. Furious, the woman says she would kill the girl. Yutong, in turn, mentions that she did not know her husband because he was an expert in draining energy from women, turning them into slaves, saying he was just doing his job and that it was nothing personal. Using a talisman to make them forget everything they had witnessed. Soon after, the bride ends up fainting. Calling someone, Yutong says he has finished his job and now they should take care of the rest. Meanwhile, that doll falls from the girl. Running towards the man, Lin Yamo realizes that it was a metamorphic fox that would be very useful.